Kia ora. My name is Robbie and I'm another white man behind a desk. And in the last episode, I complained about New Zealand's expensive film subsidies. I said they weren't being leveraged into a sustainable local film industry, and that left us at the whims of enormous multinational corporations. Jesus Christ, New Zealand! Since then, Amazon has decided they don't want to make their Lord of the Rings TV show in New Zealand, leaving us completely in the lurch, and I don't like to say I told you so, so instead, I'll just say, welcome to part 2. Last episode, we talked about how New Zealand gives away taxpayer dollars to appease giant Hollywood corporations. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about how New Zealand weakened unions and workers' rights to appease giant Hollywood corporations, proving that just because you're kissing Hollywood's ass doesn't mean you can't also be giving them a reach around. So, how did it all begin? Well, once upon a time, there was a man named Peter Jackson who started making some movies about a thinly veiled race war and a short dude chucking away some jewellery. And the movies did really well. The Lord of the Rings won 17 Academy Awards, earned nearly $3 billion at the box office, and according to the New Zealand Herald, as of 2020, Peter Jackson has nearly reached billionaire status. Good for him! After making a very good trilogy of fantasy films, Jackson decided it was time to make a very bad trilogy of fantasy films, so he signed on to direct The Hobbit. However, after the extraordinary success of The Lord of the Rings, New Zealand actors started to think they might not be getting a fair deal. To quote Rebecca McPhee's biography of New Zealand union leader Helen Kelly, unlike their international peers, New Zealand actors didn't work under union contracts and were increasingly aggrieved that their pay and conditions seemed to be getting worse, despite the growth and success of the New Zealand film sector. In the global film industry, New Zealand casts and crews had become known as Mexicans of the South Pacific. Which just goes to show that even when America is trying to insult a different country, they won't miss a chance to take a swipe at Mexico. I'm very sorry, Mexico. Now, here in Aotearoa, actors are represented by an organisation called Equity New Zealand. And in 2010, Equity New Zealand thought that The Hobbit would be a good opportunity to get a lot of international attention for the plight of the New Zealand actor. At the time, Equity New Zealand was also a part of a bigger Australian union called Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, or MEA. It's easy to remember the acronym MEA because it's also how Australians sound when they pronounce the word me. So, together, Equity New Zealand and MEA demanded that New Zealand actors be allowed to negotiate collective agreements like their peers in the US and the UK. In solidarity, the International Federation of Actors decided to boycott the Hobbit movies until these demands were met. And that was a pretty big deal, because nobody really cares if you don't get to have that guy from Shortland Street playing a dwarf. But Warner Brothers will definitely pay attention if they don't get to put Serene McKellen in a big silly hat. They love putting Serene McKellen in a big silly hat. So soon the threat emerged from Warner Brothers that they might just abandon New Zealand and film The Hobbit in another country, where the actors weren't massive divas who demanded things like rights and fairness. And for some reason, I guess because none of us had actually seen the Hobbit movies yet, New Zealanders were horrified at the prospect of losing Warner Brothers business. And we promptly turned all of our anger against the Actors Union for jeopardizing our relationship with Hollywood. Which is a friendly reminder that just because you're an underdog fighting an enormously powerful bad guy, that doesn't necessarily mean the public will be on your side. That kind of thing really only happens in Warner Brothers movies. They work very hard to make sure it's not something that happens in real life. Congratulations, Warner Brothers. Good job. Now, at this point, it was clear that Equity New Zealand were ballsing the whole thing up and massively out of their depth. So, the late great Helen Kelly from the Council of Trade Unions was called in to help. Kelly and the CTU managed to reach an agreement with Warner Brothers that a collective agreement would be negotiated by Equity New Zealand and New Zealand's Screen Production and Development Association. Everyone was happy with the deal, and the actors' boycott was called off. Problem solved. End of story. Except The general public didn't know anything about the deal, and people thought the actors' boycott was still going on. In a decision that Helen Kelly would go on to regret, it was agreed that the deal would not be announced until Warner Brothers was ready to make the announcement. Meanwhile, film workers were called to Sir Peter Jackson's studios in Miramar, and again, I'm quoting McPhee, they were riled up by predictions of massive job losses caused by the boycott, which, remember, had already been called off. And they were handed a lengthy flyer alleging that the MEAA was putting the entire New Zealand film industry at serious risk of collapse. At the end of the meeting, they grabbed ready-made placards and headed downtown on an anti-union march. Later that night, Jackson put out a statement. Warner's, he claimed, was on its way to New Zealand to make arrangements to pull the production out of New Zealand. So, on Labour Day 2010, a public holiday set aside to celebrate the victories of the New Zealand union movement, Warner Brothers lobbyists and executives arrived in New Zealand ready to undermine the victories of the New Zealand union movement. They met with then Prime Minister John Key, who passed a new law overnight. The law was called the Employment Relations Film Production Work Amendment Act 2010. Fun title. And it clarified that unless it was explicitly stated in your contract, if you worked in film, you were not an employee. No matter how much it seemed like you were definitely an employee, you weren't allowed to argue that to the Employment Relations Authority. If you worked in film, you were a freelancing contractor. It was later revealed that the national government knew all about the agreement that had already been reached and deliberately withheld that information from the public. They argued later that the agreement was irrelevant and the amendment had to go through either way. But the point still holds that they were happy to exploit the public's misunderstanding of the situation to help them get the law through. It's what an ordinary non-politician might call a dick move. And that dick move is now known, colloquially, as the Hobbit Law. Whew! So, here we are. The Hobbit Law has been in effect for 11 years. And you might be wondering, what does the darn thing do? Well, the main thing it does is it makes sure that if you work in film and your contract doesn't say that you're an employee, then you can't argue that you're an employee to the ERA. Doesn't matter if you work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, year in and year out. You're a contractor because you're making a movie. It doesn't make sense, but laws don't have to make sense. People just have to write them down. The second thing it means is that while people who work in film can be part of a union, their union can't really do very much. And that's because as a contractor, the state thinks of you as your own little company. And all the other workers are their own little company too. And if companies band together to demand higher prices, then the Commerce Commission steps in and says, hey, that's a cabal. You stop that. You stop that. And while that might make sense for petrol companies or supermarkets, it turns out that a single background actor on Shortland Street actually has quite a lot less power than, for example, the entirety of New World. Had a bit of trouble with that sentence. And while it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people who work in film to be labelled as contractors, because films usually only operate for a few months and screen workers are often sole traders who go from job to job, that isn't the case for everyone. It's certainly not the case for people at Weta, for example, who sometimes work tireless hours for years at a time trying to get the shading on Yogi Bear's face just so. And the Hobbit Law doesn't just directly limit the rights of individual screen workers, it also has real effects on workplace culture. Weta Digital has been alleged to have allowed some pretty awful behaviour, which is maybe a little harder to fight back against when you can be fired at any moment because you're not an employee. To quote New Zealand screenwriter Dave Armstrong, unions are not free of sexism and bullying themselves, but try and have a porn Friday, as Weta Digital is alleged to have had, in a highly unionised workplace, such as the staff room of a secondary school, and you would have the PPTA, as well as management, shutting you down immediately. And we don't have time to go into Porn Friday, so I'll just say Porn Friday and leave it there. So the Hobbit Law is bad, and in 2017 Labour campaigned saying they were going to repeal it. Then they got into power and decided not to do that, which is a classic Labour move. But, to be fair, if they had just repealed the Hobbit Law, we'd all be back to square one. And if you remember, nobody liked square one. Remember, the actors were boycotting and Warner Brothers were threatening to leave? You remember, I was saying it just a couple of minutes ago. So, instead of repealing the Hobbit Law, Labour formed an industry working group who came up with something called the Screen Industry Workers' Bill, or SURB, which is currently making its way through Parliament. That's where we're at now. The Screen Industry Workers' Bill looks at some of the problems I've mentioned and says, let's fix those. And then it looks at other problems and says, let's leave those problems for another day. After all, we can't solve all the problems at once. We're the Labour Party. The main thing the Screen Industry Workers' Bill does is allow for collective bargaining in the screen industry. And that's really good. The bill allows for two kinds of collective agreements. Listen up, okay? First, there's occupational level agreements. That means that if there was some sort of VFX union, then they would be allowed to negotiate a set of minimum terms and conditions with Sparta. And those minimum standards would immediately apply for everyone who works in visual effects, regardless of whether they're in the union. Good stuff. Occupational level agreements. Now they exist. Secondly, the Screen Industry Workers' Bill allows for enterprise level agreements. So let's say there's already a minimum standard for all VFX artists. Well, that's great. But you're not just any VFX artist, okay? You work at Weta Digital. You're fancy. Well, thanks to the Screen Industry Workers' Bill, you can now negotiate a higher set of standards for your workplace. And that's a huge victory for everyone who works in film. And it's basically pretty much what the actors were campaigning for in 2010. Now for the problems it doesn't solve. Just because the people who work at Weta Digital are allowed to make those demands, Weta Digital doesn't have to listen to them. If Weta Digital wants to just fire everyone and replace them all, they're still allowed to do that. After the SURB is passed, the workers at Weta Digital will continue to not have the rights of an employee. You're still just a freelancer who is now allowed to team up with other freelancers. So, the Screen Industry Workers' Bill is progress, but it still doesn't give people who are absolutely being treated as employees the rights of an employee. Thanks to Sir Peter Jackson, Warner Brothers, and 3 pretty bad movies, New Zealand still has the prime example of a shitty workplace at the centre of its film industry. A shining demonstration of how not to treat your workers, carved out as an exception from typical employer expectations and subsidised by the taxpayer, is the centre of the film industry successive New Zealand governments have chosen to build. The film industry we have chosen to create in New Zealand is a heavily subsidised service industry for giant Hollywood corporations, keeping 2,000 workers in Miramar employed, making Alvin and the Chipmunks 4. And those workers aren't even dignified with the rights of an employee. And I, for one, think it's a good decision. After all, who'd want to invest in the future Taika Waititi or Jane Campion when you could heavily subsidise a VFX house who undermines the New Zealand union movement just to save Disney a few bucks when they want to add a glint of light to Captain America's shield? Good stuff, New Zealand. What a beautiful fairy tale ending. Fade to black. Roll credits.